Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, writer, and historian. It is Sunday, September 25th, 2022, and I'm here with one of my teachers, one of our Grandmaster Scholar Warriors, Professor James Small. How you doing today, Professor
I'm
James
good,
Small?
Brother
Hope
Michael. Good, sir. Good. Happy to be on with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, look, man, you and I have been going back and forth talking, and we've been talking about the film The Woman King. Okay. And we know The Woman King debuted on, I think it was September 16th. We know it came in number one opening weekend. It'll probably do something like another 12 million this weekend. And the film, you and I have both seen the film. And the film deals with the African kingdom of Dahomey. It deals with the African female, what are called African female warriors, the Agojie. And there's been a lot of talk about this movie. There are a lot of different African themes, African culture, dealing with African history, all this in the film. So I wanted to bring you on to break down some more of this history, explain to us the cultural influences that we see in the film, and also separate fact from fiction as well. And we're broadcasting on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, as well as our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, Imhotep. And for those that may not be familiar with Professor James Small, I just want to give a brief introduction. We've had him on the African History Network show, something like 12, 13 times, something like that. You've seen him in the Hidden Colors documentaries, the documentary Hapi, which deals with the role of economics in the development of civilization, from Taki Grant and Sister Felicia. And he and I are also in the documentary Elementary Genocide Part 3, from director Raheem Shabazz. Now, Professor James Small is a scholar, activist, dynamic speaker, organizational consultant. Also, he has been an activist since his teenage years. His in-depth knowledge, thought-provoking, and calm delivery are influential elements to break the programming of miseducation. He has studied extensively with Dr. John Henrik Clark, Dr. Joseph Ben Yakinen, another one of my teachers, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, who we've had on the show numerous times before as well, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Asa Hilliard, Dr. Wade Nobles, who we've had on before, Dr. Amos Wilson, and Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, who I had the pleasure of interviewing 3 times also. Now, Professor James Small taught for 15 years at the City University of New York, including 13 years at the City College of New York's Black Studies Department, where he taught courses on Pan-Africanism, Malcolm X, and on comparative African religions, which included several African spiritual systems titled African Religion and Survival. And he taught 2 years at New York City Technical College, teaching the course African Folklore and Religion, both in the diaspora and in Africa. He's traveled to Africa numerous times. He is also currently conducting, he has taught online courses on African spirituality, covering the Yoruba Ifa tradition, the Akan spiritual tradition, Vodun, and ancient Egyptian sacred science. And also, he is the historical consultant on my favorite show, Godfather of Harlem, on Epics. Okay, I can't wait for the new season to start up in January 2023. All right, so once again, we want to welcome to the African History Network show one of my teachers, one of my friends, Professor James Small. All right, brother. So thanks for taking time out today.
Yes, Brother Michael.
Yes, sir. So you've seen, and everybody watching, let us know how the audio is. I want to make sure you can hear both of us. So you've seen the film The Woman King. So we're going to start off from the beginning. What were your thoughts on it? People already know what I thought about it. I did a 3-hour broadcast last Sunday on the African History Network show. So what were your thoughts?
You
initial thoughts?
Crazy. Well, the first thing I want to mention, because a lot of people fail to mention it when they do my biography.
Okay.
I'm the successor to El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X.
Yes.
At age 21, after his assassination, I became the imam of the Muslim Mosque, Inc., where I served 11 years, while serving 18 years as his sister Ella's bodyguard.
Right.
So
I saw that in the bio. You told me don't read the whole thing.
Yeah,
So
but that part is my foundational piece.
Right.
And I just want to mention that because in The Godfather of Harlem, Malcolm
Mm-hmm.
will be assassinated
Mm-hmm.
in this last episode that's coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And we're really trying to do that in a way with dignity to him and the family and not the usual stuff we see. So
Right.
I just want people to know that I come from that. That's my birth space.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
movement.
Exactly.
But
Is that?
I saw the movie.
Mm-hmm.
I did a couple of talks on it. People just caught me off guard. I sent a couple of people to it because usually I don't go watch too many Black movies because the wrong people are producing and directing and paying for it.
Right.
So I sent a couple of the brothers from the Sons of Africa, watch it, come back, give me a good, and they had a good report. And some friends called who I love and trust, and they loved it.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a couple of shows without seeing it, and I realized something this significant you can't do that with.
Right.
So I went yesterday myself, and I sat quietly, and I was blown the hell away. You know?
Exactly.
I mean, everybody know I love Viola Davis. I mean, if her husband said, I'm divorcing Viola today, I'll tell Carol you're going to have a second wife in the house because I'm going to propose tomorrow. She is one extraordinary actress.
Yes.
One hell of a professional when it comes to this industry with all the things I've read about her.
Mm-hmm.
But watching this performance, just like you don't get no better playing a role.
Right.
From start to, she don't let up, you know.
Right.
From the opening line to the last moment, this woman is portraying that general who would then become the king. And the one thing I'm going to say to our people, a woman king is not an anomaly in Africa. We got women kings in Africa right now. Matter of fact, one of them is my goddaughter, Diambi, King of the Congo. Okay,
what's her name again? What's her name again?
Diambi. King Diambi. She's king of the Order of the Leopards. She sits on the throne that once held by Nzinga and expanded into the total of the Congo itself.
Right.
She's from the Luba people in the southeast, where she's a queen of the Luba kingdom, but she's king of the Congo kingdom. Hatshepsut in early Egypt was the king of Egypt. Right. And we know of at least 3 to 4 other female kings of Egypt before Hatshepsut. All right. Right now, there's at least 5 woman kings in Nigeria in the different kingdoms. So this is nothing new. If you understand African culture, and you can take this back to Aset in ancient Kemet, the woman is the power, and she gives to the man the authority. Operating from the throne is authority, but being granted that authority comes from the power, which is the female structure in African society. Let me show how it works in, say, Ghana, and then we'll come back to the movie, right?
Okay.
Let's take the Ashanti Nation, the Asantehene, King of Kings of the Asante Nation, gets to be the king because he's a son of a sister of the king he's replacing. So multiple men are raised to be king, but at the end of the day, the women who raise them choose the best, most ethical, most prolific, most prepared one, and recommend that person to the men to be installed. Only the women can bring you to kingship. The men carry out the ceremonial process, but it is the power that grants the man the authority. Take it all the way back to Kemet. A lot of people is into Kemet lately. Go back to ancient Kemet, and you will see Aset sitting, and she has a chair on her head. That's the throne of Earth. That's the throne of Africa.
Right.
The chair on her head is a symbol that she, the woman, is the throne. So who's the King of Kings in ancient Kemet, right? The king of kings in ancient Kemet, every king have to become who? Haru. Haru sits on the lap of Aset because the lap of the woman is the throne of earth. See, that's African understanding of culture.
Right.
And when you sit on that throne, right, you do not sit as yourself. You sit as your ancestors.
Right.
That's picture right here. That's Haru sitting on the throne. The throne of earth is Aset. And when he sits on the throne, he's sitting on the throne as the ancestors because Aset represents the line to divine itself, which is the primary ancestor of the human race. So that's what African spiritual culture about kingship is all about. And if you understand this, it's easy to understand why there's a woman king being exalted in this movie. Yes, a lot of the movie is fiction, like most movies are.
Correct.
But a lot of it is historical.
Right.
Even if the timeline may not be on, the events is historically rooted. And then when you look at the cultural pieces, which we could talk about as we go along, I'll mention some up front. There's a young man named Malik.
Yes.
And you'll find a young lady who would become known as the daughter to the general, who's played by Sister Viola. She, on occasion, because she developed a friendship with this young man, gives him a statue of Ogun.
Right.
Ogun is one of the primary orishas and deities of the Yoruba tradition or the Ifa tradition. And you'll hear them talk about the Ifa tradition throughout because that is the spiritual tradition of Dahomey, because Dahomey is an extension of the original Yoruba kingdom. Right. Matter of fact, it was founded by one of the sons of the founder of the Yoruba kingdom. And so that tradition is there. And what are you going to see happen to the young man in the movie is he will transform from a young man coming from Brazil, whose mother is African, who had been enslaved, and whose father was European. But on her mother's deathbed, her mother told him he needed to go back home to find himself. Go back to her land, her home of Dahomey, because that is his home. And so the statuette that she gives him is of the one Orisha that is the primary Orisha of transformation of the human character. And you will see the transformation of Malik as you watch the movie. It's just beautifully done.
This is what I've been talking about.
I know the director. I've heard of her.
Gina Prince-Bythewood, who directed Love and Basketball.
Okay, so
African-American woman, just so people don't know.
I love that piece, right?
Yes.
But I've been working in studio with Godfather every day, 12-hour days sometimes, going on now 3 years, and working on the project with the writers and others for the last 6 years. So I've learned a lot about how this thing works. And what I saw yesterday in the theater, those Black women kicked butt and putting together a document that every Black person should be proud of. Exactly. You see, I see a couple of little flaws, but I'm not going to even mention them. You know why? Because it's overridden by the positive to such an extent, they're not noticeable in your consciousness.
That's what I've been saying. Exactly. And here's the thing. So I have we have 1 million followers on our fan page, the African History Network. So I've been posting a lot about the movie. I saw it, been posting articles about it, video clips, parts of interviews with Viola Davis, things like this. And 99.9% of the people who saw the movie loved the movie. They say they were blown away by it. And then I talked to people who at first said they weren't going to see it, and they saw the movie. They were blown away by it as well. Okay, this is phenomenal.
That was me. I wasn't initially going to see it. I'm tired of them doing the smile in your face and poisoning us on the backhand, right? Right. That didn't happen this time. What I saw this time was Black artists, Black craftsperson, Black technician, Black actors doing an interpretation in fiction and history with African folklore that you just got to see to believe. And so I call all my children and said, take my grandkids, buckle
Right.
up, hook up, take my grandkids. They got to
Right.
go see this piece.
Right,
And
exactly.
I don't do that very often because I'm not a movie goer. I don't even go to the movies.
Right.
You know? But
Exactly.
this one treated African history with what I like to call African integrity.
African integrity.
African integrity was so glowing. And not just the visual, but in the dialogue. You heard this praising in the dialogue. This African dignity in the dialogue. This African love in the dialogue. I go like, damn, this is really good. And I found myself crying on more than one occasion. I don't do that.
Right. I cried at the end. I shed some tears at the end.
My breath a couple of times. I was hit so heavy because I love African history like you.
Right.
I've absorbed myself in it. I live it. And that movie had me reeling. And I've been to Benin. I've been to Dahomey. I've been in the very palace they shot the film in multiple times.
Yes.
I've been before the voodoo pope on my knees to be blessed because I'm a voodoo adapt, not a priest. I'm an adapt, one who practices, who knows the tradition.
A Vodun.
Yes. Well, the state religion in Benin is Vodun.
Vodun, right.
Vodun is the Dahomey manifestation of what we call Yoruba.
Yeah.
Same
the spiritual system.
But manifests different in different cultures, different locations. It's Ifa at the end of the day. And the word voodoo in that language means the essence of the divine within either nature or the human being. That's what voodoo means, the essence of the divine.
Right. Well, we're gonna go. I'm gonna go to the official synopsis of the movie to give some people the background information on the movie, on the synopsis, and then we're going to continue. I want you to explain African integrity in just a minute, but first I got to recognize my friend, and I'm also Professor Hunter Adams. He's watching right now. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Professor Hunter Adams, thanks so much for watching. He said, I agree, Professor James Small. So absolutely. So let's look at this here. So the official website is thewomanking.movie, thewomanking.movie. I want to look at the official synopsis, and then we're going to delve deeper. Because one of the things I want to just briefly explain to people is when you hear that a movie is based on a true story, right? You really have to understand what that means, because there are 4 different types of true story screenplays. There are 4 different types of ways to tell the story. And so The Woman King is the remarkable, this is the official synopsis. The Woman King is the remarkable story of the Agojie, the all-female unit of what they call warriors who protected the African kingdom of Dahomey in the 1800s with skills and a fierceness unlike anything the world has ever seen. Quote unquote, inspired. This is the key word, everybody. Inspired by true events, The Woman King follows the emotionally epic journey of General Naniska, played by Oscar winner Viola Davis, and it was her production company, her and her husband Julius, their production company that produced this film, as she trains the next generation of recruits and readies them for battle against an enemy determined to destroy their way of life. Some things are worth fighting for. It's directed by Gina Prince-Bythewood, who's an African-American female woman. Story played by Maria Bello and Dana Stevens, 2 white women, and produced by Kathy Schulman, Viola Davis, husband Julius Tennant, and Maria Bello. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to go through that, Professor Small, very quickly here is, and I've done a ton of research on the film as well. There is, I've experienced this before with other movies, and you have to be careful when you hear a term like based on a true story. You have to really understand what it is. So very quickly, there are 4 ways to tell these historical movies. Okay, this is a good article everybody can read. It's from Screencraft. Is your script based on, quote unquote, based on or inspired by a true story? What's the difference? So you have based on a true story, you have based on true events, you have inspired by a true story, and inspired by true events. Those are 4 different types of ways of telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
Each one has different levels of fiction interwoven into them. The Woman King, according to the official synopsis, is inspired by true events. Okay. I want to briefly explain what that means. Screenplays don't come as loose as the term, quote unquote, true, as they do with stories, quote unquote, inspired by true events. Okay. This is not the attack of Woman King. I just want people to understand this. These scripts take a true event. We can blow this up even more. These scripts take a true event and tell a cinematic story with nearly all fictional characters and fictional macro events. Okay. So once again, I study a lot of movies. I've done lectures dealing with different movies. So you just have to understand how they're telling this movie. Is it based on a true story? Is it based on true events? Is it inspired by a true story or inspired by true events? Inspired by true events, by definition, based upon the industry, is going to have more fiction in it than the other ways of telling these stories. Okay. Go ahead, Professor Small.
Well, the key thing, because I work with the Godfather of Harlem.
Yes,
and
exactly.
It's based on true events.
Yes.
And The Godfather of Harlem, we really do the autobiography of Malcolm X. We've actually devoted more time to doing that than any other cinematic production ever. Okay. Malcolm X has been in something like about 12 episodes, also, no, 22 episodes when it's over, 22 or 23 episodes of this piece. And my fighting there is to keep what I call African integrity and historical authenticity, which is not easy. Okay.
Exactly.
But it has gotten easy because the writers are both black and white, 50%. But they come from
on Godfather of Harlem. On Godfather of Harlem.
They come from the industry's protocols. So here comes this guy from a Black Studies, Black nationalist background, who knows nothing about writing, but want to see images on the screen that reflect African integrity, and reflect the historical authenticity that I think it should. But it's fiction. It's like, how do we take Malcolm X? How do we take Adam Powell? How do we take Bumpy Johnson and create a fictional story about a gangster who partners with civil rights and human rights leaders to get control of Harlem from the white operators of Harlem? How do you tell that fictional story using these historical characters and some historical events? And sitting, most of my work is done, even though I go in studio every day, my work is done with the writers in the writer's workshop before it gets to a director, before it gets to the big boys to say, okay, this is cool. And so that's where we get a chance to say, this is what the dialogue is going to look like. This is what the scene is going to look like. This is what's going to be in that room. This is what the costume is going to look like. This is what the attitude is going to be, etc. And so when I'm watching this piece, having spent so much time in Togo, Benin, and Ghana over the last 3 decades, I'm there. I mean, I'm transformed out of that theater. I'm in that palace in Dahomey where I've been multiple times. And I'm feeling the spirit of the Agojie. Because I've heard them talk about it so often. They lecture to us when we go there. The king even engaged in the lecture with us so that we begin to appreciate the history. It is not a myth that there was a woman army or women brigades that was a part of the greater Dahomey army. It wasn't a complete woman army. They had men too. But the women's brigade, the men made up the infantry. The women made up the battle soldiers, and they were fierce.
Right.
And they do little demonstrations for you when you go to visit, you know, and you begin to appreciate this. And I'm watching, and it goes. And I've also studied, like you, many of the rebellions and the resistance on the ground in Africa before we got on the slave ship. Many of the wars, many of the jihads to try and stop the slave trade, which had been going on for 1,500 years plus before 1492. So we had been at war for a long time against this thing. I've been to places where we saw part of the resistance up in northern Ghana and other areas where the people built houses without windows, if you can imagine that, right? And the fence around the house is 10 foot tall. The housing compound is 10 foot tall, but the gateway to get in the house is 2 feet tall. So you got to get on your knees to crawl into the courtyard. So an enemy would lose his head trying to come down, you understand? But that was the defensive mechanism that our people put in place. They had the windows on the roofs. The roofs open up so that they could get sunlight and air. And they just had slit in the walls to use their arrows. So we resisted. So the phenomena that is being portrayed is not abnormal nor unusual. The unusual thing is that there is an army that have a significant female presence leading it. And in this story, the story is about an extraordinary female general who would become king.
Right. The woman king. Yep.
The woman king. And so the storyline itself of how they trained and the dignity that's required and the discipline that's required and the sacrifices that's required of these women. You can't get married. You can't have children. You have to devote yourself to this, because this is your devotion to saving the kingdom of Dahomey, protecting the kingdom of Dahomey, not just, and protecting our king, but not just the king. And Viola, in the dialogue, they take it to another level when she's talking to the king. He says, we're not just going to stop slavery in Dahomey. We're going to stop slavery throughout Africa. You know?
Right.
It's not just going to be our people we're fighting for. We're going to fight for any people. If this wasn't real history, I would want it to be.
Exactly.
Okay. We've watched Wonder Woman. When I was a child, I loved Wonder Woman when I was a child.
The Amazons.
Hero.
Yep.
All right. We watched Supergirl. You know what I'm saying? They were fictitious stories about white women heroes that was saving the white community. That's cool. Now we got this massive black group of heroines saving the black community. Psychologically in your head, something is being planted that you didn't come into this without a fight. And our women, we live in a society that marginalizes women across the board, but particularly marginalized African women, both historically and currently. And to see a piece that raised African women to the level they deserve to be on, because historically they were those women. That's not a myth. There was the female army, and they were one of the best in West Africa. That's not a myth. You had females in the Egyptian army. That's not a myth. You had females, Amanatu, who led the northern Nigerian army against the Islamic incursion. That's not a myth. You had a female warrior who led the Moorish army against the Abbasid invasion into North Africa in the 800s. That's not a myth. But we have more data and information on Dahomey than we have on any of those other spaces. And the writers and the director have put together a piece showing what could have been, maybe was to some degree, on the part of the women who represent that element of society that was involved in the military defense of their nation and the projecting and protecting of their culture and their race. And it was just done beautifully. I went in thinking I was going to be critical, mean, and hard. I come out of there crying like a baby. I go like, damn. This just took it off. Just took it out.
Exactly. And there was so much, African culture, so many references to
you hear them
history.
talking about Ifa. You saw the shrines. Those shrines were authentically done. The altars were authentically done. I saw multiple deities on the altars, you know. And let me just help you with some deities, like the king. When the king sits on the throne, he doesn't sit like, say, Brother Imhotep is made king of Chicago. Well, when he's talking to me and you in the living room, he's Brother Imhotep. But when he sits on the throne, he is the ancestors of all of us, speaking for those ancestors to us and carrying out of the will of the ancestors for us. So that's the role of a king in Africa. Not a despot that's trying to be rich and wealthy, but that's not the African story. The king has no wealth in Africa. In the African traditional sense, he's taken care of by the community. He has no need desires because they take care of his need desires. But his responsibility is to interpret the ancestral will and wisdom to his community, both as priest and as jurist, because he's the head of the court in the community. That's the king in Africa, male or female.
Yeah, you know, a lot of our understanding of the term king comes from a European perspective.
Yeah.
Not from an African cultural perspective, because I saw a lot of comments saying, oh, it's the woman king. They're trying to emasculate the men and things like this. And I saw the movie. That's not the case. Go ahead.
That don't happen. Matter of fact, in the movie, the man is helping to train the women. In the movie, the man is fighting beside them as the lead musketeers that opens the way for those warriors to come in to play.
Right.
So, and all through the movie, you see that partnership between the general who leads the women and the king who she and those women serve. And then I saw nothing emasculating or demeaning at all. I saw a partnership that simply told a fictitious presentation of a reality. There's a reality of those women warriors. There was a reality of that army being made up of warriors who were women, and that they were considered by history, both white and blacks, writing at that time, as being one of the most fierce army in the field. The only thing that stopped them was the gun technology of Europe.
Right. Exactly. Okay, this is what I want to do, because we're going to come back to this and we're going to deal with some more of the history of Dahomey, and I want to show a picture of the actual Agojie. There are some good articles written. Smithsonian Mag has a really good one with Smithsonian Institute. They have a really good one dealing with the real warriors behind the woman king. It goes deep into this history. But you mentioned in Nigeria, you and I talked about this on the phone. So I posted this article a few days ago because I saw so many people, most of them didn't see the movie, saying, oh, they don't have women kings in Africa and things like this, right? So there are a number of different articles on this topic here. This one here is from gboah.com, gboah.com. Check out the 7 beautiful Nigerian female kings in charge of their kingdom, okay? And it goes through and lays them out and where they are in Nigeria. This is right now. This is not 100 years ago. This is right now, okay? Why do you think? So you talked about Hatshepsut in ancient Kemet. Okay, so she was. Tell us a little bit about Hatshepsut. She would be considered a woman king. We know she was.
The pharaoh is the king.
Pharaoh,
and she was the pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
The woman is the power in Africa. Men, give up your European genital danglings, because the power has nothing to do with gender. Okay,
right.
It has to do with roles in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Roles in nature. You came from the womb and the belly of a woman. It did not come from your belly, even though your sperm fertilized the eggs that became you. So let's look at how Africans looked at reality. We were in partnership with nature and cosmology. That's our culture is based on understanding cosmology and nature. And so when we look at the king, and as we see in Hatshepsut, her brother was too young to take the throne. He was too young to handle that responsibility. And so she, as the elder sister, had to take on the responsibility of being the pharaoh, of being the king, until her brother was trained enough and old enough to take over the role of kingship himself. And I remember when we first started studying ancient Egypt, and the white writers was all said, oh, the brother came in and he hated his sister and he scraped their name off the walls. All of that is proven to be untrue. So all of it is proven to be untrue. That's not even African culture. That's European culture. That's what they do.
Exactly.
That's not what happens in African culture, because the kingship is a spiritual position, not a political position, though they do political work. The king is surrounded by a council of elders who instructs and informs him, on his behavior. His job is to sit as the ancestors come back. I know this for a fact because I've been trained at the stool. In Ghana, I'm Nana Kofi Mpansa, the second of the Ogogo stool, under the kingship of Akua Sapong. And one of my great teachers is Nana Kwabena Nketse the fifth, who's the king of Esokado in the Western region. So we talk about these things all the time, because these are my questions. And so if one thing this movie would do is force us to study our history before we got to North America, then
and culture.
Then I'm
history and culture. Yep. Because a lot of this, because of we've all been attacked by white supremacy and racism, and
it's made us paranoid about anything.
Well, not only that, we've internalized white supremacy. We've internalized to various extents white male patriarchy. So we don't see it. We don't see, many of us don't see African women as equals.
Right.
And then you hear woman king and you say, oh, they're trying to emasculate the man, things like this. And then you have people say, oh, there were no women kings in Africa. I'm like, what are you talking about?
And we always praise, many people over here know Yaa Asantewaa.
Yaa Asantewaa.
And they said, oh, well, she was the queen mother. No, she was the queen mother until the king gets captured. Then she became the king. Because it was the queen mother who made him king, who named him king. Once the British captured the Santahene and there was no king on the throne, the responsibility of the kingship fell on Yaa Asantewaa, the queen mother of Ajisu, and she became the leader of the army of resistance against British occupation in central Ghana. So when we study the history is just so beautiful when we study it and learn about our women and really get to see, oh, wow.
Exactly.
These other people's culture. We got our own culture. We have our own look at. We have our own way of knowing things. We have our own worldview that we have imposed for ourselves on ourselves. And this becomes so important. I saw somebody talked about the book Barracoon and talked about Kofi, this one brother who was sold by Dahomeans. Even in the movie, they treated this well because the current king in the movie is criticizing his brother who started this slave trade thing. And they're trying to figure out a way.
Oh, Gezo,
How do we stop it? And the woman king, as she's now the general, is saying, we must find another way to have commodities that we can make a living off. And she sets up these palm oil plantations.
Palm oils,
to create an income for the community. And I think she had she said we could sell gold as well to get an income. And so they're looking at it and saying, wait a minute, we're trapped because these people have put us into a situation. Now, if you study the history of Africa, coastal African peoples were basically fishermen. Most of the slave trading took place on the coast, and then they would go inland with their guns and weapons and capture people. The coastal people were subjugated. Yes, some of them were involved in the slave trade at the barrel of a gun because they had been conquered and subjugated. Study the history, learn the history. And you might learn about Chief Sam, the Ghanaian who brought 3 ships over here to take us back home, and you don't even know his name. So
Face to Face Africa has an article about him.
Let's talk about Bonsu. You said the Ashanti sold us. What about King Bonsu, who marched the Ashanti army from central Ghana down to the coast, emasculated the Dutch, took over the slave dungeon, drove them all out, free all of our people, then marched the army back up to Kumasi. Let's learn these stories. Let's learn of these great heroes. We've got brothers selling drugs to us on the streets right now. We can't deny that Black people do things like that. You've got Black people killing more Black people on the streets every month than was killed in slavery any given month. We can't deny that's so, but we got to understand why that's so.
Right.
And so we had some folks in Africa who was involved in slave trading, but that was less than 1%. Let's talk about that 99% who were the victims or who were defenders of our people. Unless millions more would have got caught up and died in the slave trade.
I'm going to go to that in just a second because I want to share an excerpt of the book, Fighting the Slave Trade. Before we go to that, hey, everybody, I'm Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. We're speaking with one of my teachers, Professor James Small. We're talking about the film, The Woman King, as well as the real history of the West African kingdom of Dahomey and other history also. If you like this type of information, you can support the African History Network, $ the AHN show through Cash App, $ the AHN show through Cash App, also through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN show. This helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, keep broadcasting. I've been hosting the African History Network show for 12 years now. So this helps us keep doing the research. We also have the information at our website, TheAFricanHistoryNetwork.com, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And just very quickly, this is up for those that don't know. This is our official Cash App account, $ the AHN show, SHOW. When you go to it, it says Michael and it shows my picture there. These other ones, and there are 5 of them out there that are fake African History Network Cash App accounts that have been stealing money from us. I've opened up an investigation with Cash App. We're trying to get them shut down. So that's why I got the information here right on the homepage of our website. Okay. Now, I want to also my online classes that I teach you at our website as well. Go ahead, Professor Small.
Yeah. Well, someone said, as a Black woman, my femininity is important to me. Well, girl, go watch this movie because they ain't nothing more feminine than what I was watching yesterday. I didn't want to leave the theater. One thing this movie does not do is demean the femininity of African women. Right. Okay. It is such a the way they do it is so. I got to meet this lady who was the director. So beautifully done.
Gina Prince-Bythewood. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So beautifully done that the women, though warriors, do not lose their femininity, do not lose their sensitivity, do not lose their love of sisterhood or motherhood. It's all through the piece. It is a well done piece. It is worthy of watching. It is something that showed us that the movement of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that produced opportunities for Black writers, Black directors, and Black actors have paid off and is paying off so that we can get some credible quality cinema that would be worthy of helping to socialize our community in a more positive direction.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important that you said that there. I'm going to go to Fighting the Slave Trade in just a second, but I'm just going to put this out here. And, I learned from one of my teachers, Dr. Ray Hagins, and Dr. Ray Hagins as well.
Oh, yeah.
I may say some things that are outside the circumference of your own awareness. Just because you disagree with them or don't like them does not mean it's not true. You just have to do some more research to understand what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, because African Americans, because we're in this white supremacist system, this white male patriarchy system, unfortunately, many of us associate being feminine with being weak. And that's something projected to us by European culture. So then when
they'll change that.
Go ahead. Say that again. I
need to meet my mama to find if I wasn't her son, I'd marry that lady.
And my mama as well. Yeah, exactly.
She would slap you into the next world if you step wrong.
Right. But so when they see African female women who can beat a man's behind, then all of a sudden they're not feminine.
Right.
And we associate femininity with being weak. And it's like, no, that's coming from the white. I think you used the phrase white murder culture.
Yeah.
That's coming
from. If they want to see an example of that, they need to see the woman I've been married to for 51 years. Right. But I remember she was pregnant with our twins coming home, and she got mugged by this dude.
Right.
He put up a fight, but he got away with the purse. But she was coming from the Nation of Islam fish store. She chased this dude 6 blocks with this frozen whiting. He dropped that purse because this lady got to replace it with that big belly and that frozen fish, right? So, me and my son was laughing about that last night, talking about the movie.
and because of what we go through in this country, and because of our history, you should want a sister who can fight. You should want a sister who can help you defend the home and things like this. Unless you want to oppress the sister, okay? Unless you're afraid she's gonna whip your behind because maybe you did something wrong or something like that, right? But you should want a sister who can fight. Okay, so all right. I want to go to this right here. This is an excerpt of the book Fighting the Slave Trade by a brilliant sister, Dr. Sylvian Diop. You and I talked about this briefly today. This is the synopsis is at Amazon.com. You can try to get it from an African-American book dealer. If not, maybe Amazon. It's called Fighting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies. This is going to segue into our further discussion with Dahomey and their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, Professor Small. Fighting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies. This book came out in 2003. Sylvian Diop is a brilliant sister. I'm trying to get on the African History Network show. She's the author of many books. Here's the official synopsis of this book. While most studies of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade specifically, focus on captives and on their ethnic origins, the question of how the Africans organized their familial communal lives to resist and assail the transatlantic slave trade has not received adequate attention. How Africans fought back against this. But our picture of the slave trade is incomplete without an examination of the ways in which men and women responded to the threat and reality of enslavement and deportation. Fighting the Slave Trade is the first book to, possibly so, this came out in 2003. Fighting the Slave Trade is the first book to explore in a systematic manner the strategies Africans used to protect and defend themselves and their communities from the onslaught of the transatlantic slave trade, and how they fought back against the transatlantic slave trade. It challenges widely held myths of African passivity and general complicity in the slave trade, and shows that resistance to enslavement and to involvement in the slave trade was much more pervasive than has been acknowledged by the orthodox interpretation of historical literature. Focused on West Africa, where Dahomey was and Benin currently is, focused on West Africa, the essays collected here examine in detail the defensive, protective, and offensive strategies of individuals, families, communities, and states. In chapters discussing the manipulation of the environment, resettlement, the redemption of captives, the transformation of social relations, political centralization, marriage, violent assaults on ships and entrepots, shipboard revolts like the Amistad slave rebellion, 1839, and controlled participation in the slave trade as a way to procure the means to attack the slave trade. Fighting the Slave Trade presents a much more complete picture of the West African slave trade than has been previously available. Go ahead, Professor Small.
Yes, sir. I mean, and it's like we make the mistake when we just hear a cliche or a term. Most people who never heard the word Dahomey until a month ago, all of a sudden now is telling us how Dahomey was in the slave trade. Dahomey came to power politically around the 1720s, 1730. It does not get involved in the slave trade because it doesn't build up a military with the capability until around the 1760s to 1780s. That is over by 1825. Now, we're not talking about an appreciable amount of historical time. If you put everything in history on a timeline, you get a sense of what I'm talking about. And then the numbers, you look at the numbers. How much? What was the numbers? 5,000, 10,000? Even that would be too much. But if we look at the numbers, let's stop playing. If you understand how the European works, and the best way I can do is go to the country where I have a hotel, I have a business, I have a home, and I've been back and forth living there for 30 years, Ghana. What they do, they conquer the coastal people and subdue them.
Right.
With their military technology. And then they force these coastal people to engage in the slave trade with them for their life. And as you saw that piece you just read, the coastal people also find ways to fight back. This was the Fanti Nation, where the Elmina Castle was built, the slave dungeon, and where the Cape Coast slave dungeon was built. And what the Fanti would end up doing with the Portuguese, behind the Portuguese back, they partnered with the Dutch and helped the Dutch defeat the Portuguese and drive them out of West Africa. But because of gun technology, again, they were betrayed by the Dutch. You understand? But they would then find a way to and they found a way to then partner with the British to defeat the Dutch. And when they had enough knowledge and understanding of technology and gun warfare, that same Fanti people drove the British out of Fanti region in Central Africa, forcing them to run to Accra for their life in one of the first classical guerrilla warfare scenes in history. So we need to study this thing. Yes, some of our people sell us drugs on the street, but you and I don't sell drugs to our people.
Correct.
Some of our people engage in careless gun violence in our community that kills our women and our babies, but that's not 99% of our people. Some of our people engage in the slave trade, some out of greed. I wouldn't deny that. Most out of duress because they were at the barrel of the gun of the enemy with the gun technology. But go down and just study. So you can look at something like the Battle of Islamabad down in South Africa, where Setuweya takes on the British Army with swords and spears, killed 2,000 in one day, all right? And caused the fall of the Robespierre government in London, because they were shocked. How could y'all let this happen? These folks ain't got no guns. You know what they called us, right? Go all the way up to where we looking at the Berlin Conference. After the Berlin Conference, the invasion of Sudan, Muhammad Ahmed takes on 23,000 British troops and Turkish, Egyptian troops, and send only 3,000 back up to Egypt alive. Talk about resistance. Go with Amanatu and the kingdom that was just above. There's just so many episodes of the great heroine and heroes that fought in these wars of liberation and fought of slave resistance. You will never sit back and talk about Africans sold us. Because guess who Africans were? That was your uncle, your cousin, your grandma, your brother, your great-grandma. Stop being foolish and learn the history of the great people. The genocide would have been more pervasive had we not resisted in such a beautiful and strong way for so long. And
we fought every step of the way.
And our women played a pivotal role, not just in Dahomey, but in other kingdoms in that resistance movement, many of them being the generals at the head of armies. Learn their story, and you'll learn how to love yourself more deeply and appreciate and respect. That's what I call African integrity.
Exactly. When we look at Dahomey, and Dahomey really comes to power about 1720, and they're going to defeat Ouida. How do you pronounce that? Ouida? Okay. There's a couple of different spellings of it. So talk about cultural servitude versus chattel slavery.
Right.
Because what happens is a lot of Europeans will say, "Oh, Africans are slaves. Yeah. Africans had slaves. You all started this, blah, blah, blah." Talk about the cultural servitude system that Africans had compared to the chattel slavery that Europeans created.
Right. Let me correct one sister so I don't break her heart. She said the Portuguese built no castles. They built dungeons. Didn't you hear me correct myself? So stop playing. I corrected myself.
Right. They built dungeons.
But I understand. Yes. I understand. Yes. Well, that's Brother Leo. And of course, they built concentration camps. Yeah, I wouldn't even call them dungeons. They were concentration camps. But servitude, every society had it. Dr. Clark taught us that Africans didn't have prisons. And the reason they didn't have prisons, because they had a servitude system when you committed a crime in the community. Or if there was a war between two groups, which was rare, because the way we fought war in Africa, the heroes fought, okay? Not armies. Africa had very few standing armies. That's why we took such a whipping. We learned to develop standing armies after the invasion started, but even Egypt didn't have standing armies until they got their butt kicked. And they realized we got to build one. The only place where the spiritual foreseeing of the necessity for that was with Shaka in Zululand, where the spirit told him this force was coming, and he developed a standing army to meet that force. But in most other places, we didn't have a standing army. But what would occur when there was a conflict between two communities, and they had to go to war, the captives were brought to serve off almost like the indentured system structure the European had, except in Africa, no one took your name away. No one took your family lineage away. No one took your humanity away. No one took your spiritual identity away. And you can grow up to become the king of the very community that you are serving in.
Right.
Okay? You can grow up to marry royalty in the house in which you are serving to. That was the norm. The idea was you've committed a crime against the greater social order, and so you have to be transformed. Okay? You have to go through a transformation process and a socialization process that you can be a part of society without causing gross disruption of that society. And that servitude process that we see in multiple places in Africa did not involve putting you in prison, putting you in chains, putting you before firing squads, or anything like that. You know? Right. It involves you becoming a part of the very community you had the conflict with. And when your time of service was over, you can either go back to your home if that's what you wanted to do, or remain a part of this community if that's what you want to do.
Right. So when we, and I've talked to Professor Kabahai Wapa-Kamene about this as well. You know him, and he's one of my teachers also. The culture, and we see this in the film because there's at least, there's at least one woman who's Agojie in the film who came from another ethnic group, and there was a fight between them. She was captured and she was brought in to be made Agojie, and brought into Dahomey. So we see this take place. Now Europeans had their feudalistic system with the lords and the serfs. Okay. And they're going to superimpose this feudalistic system onto the cultural servitude that Africans had to create chattel slavery, to create what we call chattel slavery, basically. But talk about that for a minute.
You know, the European system was not about family structure. It was about class and caste structure. Africa was not about class and caste structure. It's about family structure. So when you came into another community, that person's household you went into, depending on age strata, that was your father, that was your mother, that was your auntie. You were their child. That's what the European had was something completely different. It was based on caste and class, depending on power and wealth. That was not what the African kingdom was built on. The African kingdom was built on the fact that the king itself is the father of the community, because he represents the ancestors for that community. Africans don't have queens in the way Europeans do. The king's wife is not a queen. Okay. And
in the African society, the king's wife is not a queen.
In modern day African society, who's trying to play the European thing, you see a little bit of that. But in traditional ancient African society, your wife is not the queen. She's just your wife. Okay. the queen mother is your sister or your auntie or cousin.
Okay.
But your wife would never be the queen. And the reason they do that, so that fighting for the throne thing never happens. So it is the collective body of women called the queen mothers who select from among the best of the young men they have raised, because they know them better than anybody else, because they raised them from infancy, to be the next king. And if a man was not available to assume that responsibility, then they chose a woman who was skilled, trained, and tooled to carry that power and that responsibility, both spiritually, judiciary-wise, and politically.
Okay, so this goes back to Auset with the throne on her head.
Absolutely.
Because Auset means the name Auset, from my understanding, means she of throne. Yeah. She of throne.
She is the throne.
She is the throne. Yeah. Okay, she is the throne. And it's the woman.
She is woman. She's not, there's nobody named Auset.
Right.
Auset is symbolic of the African woman.
Right, symbolic of the African woman, because it's the African woman who decides which man will sit on the throne. Okay, all right, and in many societies is it that in some societies is it that the lineage was matrilineal, which went through the woman side of the family, and
we kept it in America. We had a kind of a term we used that people thought was joking: mama's baby, daddy's maybe.
right.
The way they solve the bloodline is to go to the one place where you know the authenticity of a bloodline.
Right.
And that means it's not matriarchal. Matriarchal means women rule. That's a white folks term. It's
matrilineal.
No, it's matrifocal.
Matrifocal. Okay.
Meaning you must train, you trace, and it was no denigration to the man. I love my wife, but I know it's the one way to be sure that this child is who we say he is to see what womb the child came out of.
Right.
There's no way to find out what sperm the child came from. And we knew that way back then when there was no microscope or nothing at hand. We were clear. Okay.
Right.
And so you talk about matrifocal. Now, since Islam, well, going all the way back to remember, we get the Hyksos invasion, the Greek invasion, and well, first the Hyksos, and then you get two Hyksos. Hittites, you get two Hittites invasion in northeastern Africa. Then you get the two Assyrian invasion of it. Then you get the Persians, two Persian invasion, then the Greek invasion, then the Roman invasion, and then their children, their descendants, the Arabs. See, people don't know who the Arabs are. These are the descendants of the Greeks and the Romans, and the Assyrians and the Hittites and the Hyksos mix up now, marrying into one another, and then they hit us in the 8th century and have the deepest incursion into Africa, and that's where you see a lot of the patriarchal systems in the areas that was once conquered by Islam or still fundamentally Islamic in Africa. So you see the patriarchal there. But in traditional non-Islamic Africa, it's matrifocal, almost 100%.
Okay. Now, when we talk about Dahomey, I know you and I were talking about this earlier today, and Dahomey is made to be, and I see like some European writers doing this. I see this in the media. Dahomey is being made out to be like they were more involved in the transatlantic slave trade than Great Britain was.
Yeah,
and Great Britain takes out like they take out 3.1. Great Britain was involved from 1562 to 1834 when they finally, even after 1807. We'll talk about 1807 in just a minute. They involved for 272 years. Talk about Dahomey and how it gets involved in the transatlantic slave trade.
Well, again, for the same reason, Dahomey in 1720, when the kingdom is formed, or when it comes to power, it was always a small kingdom. And remember, Dahomey wasn't the size of today's Benin.
Right.
It was a small kingdom within that territory. There was Vida, Cotonou, and other kingdoms on the coast that was rivaling them in terms of commerce and trade. But once the European came, the European got involved immediately in capturing Africans for the slave trade. And the first thing they would do was to bring to servitude the coastal population. Okay, that's the Wina, the Contonu, because those people don't have guns. So we can understand the degree to which gun technology plays in the slave trade.
Right.
Okay.
14th century.
Came there with militaries, with cannons, and with guns. And in one day, they can level all the African villages in the community. People have never even heard an explosion before. You got to get the psychology of all of that. So once you find yourself being invaded and occupied by these people, and they're making you a part of their army. So now you're someone who you had a traditional argument with, and y'all would have a palaver over it and settle it with somebody bringing some cocoa and something else. You got an army with people with guns now marching you against that foe.
Right.
And capturing those people and putting them in slavery. So by the time you get, and then the other piece we keep forgetting, and we need to call it out for what it is. There's an Islamic slave system in place in Africa for 1,500 plus years before 1492. There's the trans-Indian Ocean slave trade. There's the trans-Saharan slave trade. And before they were bringing Africans enslaved to North America, they were taking them enslaved to Europe. We never talk about slavery in Europe. You know, we try to play with the few people who call, oh, the Moors, there's a picture of a Moor, there's a statue of a Moor. No, we were enslaved in Europe. Okay? That's the reason the Moors went into Spain. They were chasing the Visigoth, the German, back out of North Africa.
The Vandals and the Visigoths.
Right. Yep. So for the comeback, but to let people know about from the 8th century forward, Islamic nations have not invaded Africa. And one of the first things they do is get involved in this, putting us into slavery. They got into what we call today ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide. Cultural genocide is imposing their religion on us and destroying our religious spaces. And those of us who resist was either killed or sold into slavery. So this has gone on for 1,500 years. So this is what the Africans got at his back when the Portuguese are coming. So we're looking at the Portuguese and them with some welcoming because we think we've got a force that can deal with the force that we've been dealing with. And we got caught in the catch-22 because those forces were in collaboration with one another. And no one talked about that collaboration.
Okay, so with Dahomey, they have a cultural servitude system just like African societies did.
Anywhere in the Bantu area was pretty much the same because the boundaries we see today, those boundaries weren't there then.
Yeah, they come from the Berlin Conference largely.
Right.
Yeah,
we're talking about the major empire which they're talking about in the films called the Oyo.
Oh, that's what I was about to ask. Explain the Oyo Empire and the conflict between the Oyo Empire and Dahomey.
The greater Yoruba nation.
Right.
Yoruba is not a religion. Yoruba is a people. Right?
And just 1 second, everybody watching, give us a thumbs up, give us a heart on this broadcast. Go ahead, Professor Small. Answer that question. I'll be right back.
So
you can go ahead, keep talking.
The Yoruba nation and the founder of that nation had 4 sons who went out in different places and settled other lands and built other kingdoms. Well, Dahomey is one of those kingdoms that members of the Yoruba royal family developed and built. But over time, like what happens between many communities, conflict developed around trade, conflict developed around secession, conflict developed around all kinds of things. So Dahomey breaks away from the Oyo kingdom, okay? And so there's a conflict between them. But that even in the story, the fictitious thing of the Oyo kingdom being big into slavery, they don't get into slavery until later on in the greater Yoruba wars that would take place after this period of time that the Dahomey is being talked about. But there's a conflict between Dahomey and the Yoruba land. Yoruba land is being invaded by the British, or by this time have been invaded by the British This is the great burning of Benin and the robbing of Benin of all of its wealth and art and so forth that we hear about in history, but we don't connect it to nothing, right? But there's a greater Yoruba war going on between the people. And these boundaries called Nigeria, they're not there then, okay?
Right.
They're greater boundaries. People have other kinds of kingdom designs. And there's conflicts between some of these kingdoms, mostly around trade, okay? But you got something else happening at the same time. As the Muslim wars of genocide and ethnic cleansing is taking place in the Nile Valley with the Mamluk Turks and the Seljuk Turks, and then finally the Ottoman Turks by the 9th century and the end of the 9th century, beginning of the 10th century. They're pushing millions of people out of the Nile Valley into West Africa. Y'all hear what I'm saying? They're pushing millions of people out of the Nile Valley into West Africa, in through Chad, in through Cameroon, into Nigeria, down into Ghana. This population, through what is called Burkina Faso, this is the population of the people. Everybody always asks, what happened to the Egyptian? Well, we're talking to each other here right now, okay? Because a great number of those refugees, millions of refugees scattered to the south and to the west, because of the Turkish and the Arab ethnic cleansing that goes on for hundreds of years leading up to the 1400s, are caught as the vulnerable population in what becomes known as the transatlantic slave trade. And I know a lot of us don't go there with that piece, but you've got to understand, who are these people? And so the kingdoms like Dahomey on the coast, somebody coming from the north, that's the northeast, have brought captives that they want to sell to another community because they don't need that expansion in their population. And this group of captives was either hostile to them or refugees that they felt was taking their space away from them. Okay. And that population, most time, that refugee population was at least able to defend itself, end up being caught in the trade. And it wasn't a trade at all. It was a war of genocide against African people. There was no transatlantic slave trade. Nobody was trading anything. People were being captured. People were being murdered. People were being raped. Villages were being burned to the ground. Okay? People were being slaughtered to get enough so you can make $200-300 in that day's money, which would be a couple of $1,000s in this day's money, or for one human being to do labor in the Western Hemisphere, where he was worked to death in 10 to 15 years and would be replaced with someone else, a process that went on for 400 years plus.
Exactly.
Dahomey got caught up in this, and what the movie shows, fictitious or not, they did do it. How do we get out of this? How do we work our way out, fight our way out of this contradiction? And I thought they did a beautiful job in describing the contradiction of the slave trade and describing the efforts of whatever African kingdom used that methodology to get out of the contradiction, whether it was Dahomey, Ashanti, Yoruba, Igbo, Manding, you know, we all
that dealt with selling the palm oil. That dealt with selling the palm. Okay. So at what point does in actual history, at what point does Dahomey get, so we know you have later, you're going to have the Franco-Dahomean Wars, 1890, 1894, and Dahomey is going to be absorbed into the, I guess you would say, French colonies.
Benin.
Dahomey's, Benin, yeah. Okay, so at what point does Dahomey stop selling African captives to the Europeans?
Well, they said the story in 1823, but
that's where it starts, opens up, 1823.
But that's not the real date. The date would be further back up. All right. If we were to look at that conflict played out, we'd probably be looking at Dahomey comes up as a kingdom in 1720.
20, right.
But you don't have power when you come into being. It takes you another 30, 40 years to build up an army, to build up a front, to build up a reputation. So Dahomey don't really get into the slave trade thing until around the seven, they try to talk about the kingdom starting in the 1600s. That's the extension of the Oyo kingdom. That's not Dahomey yet. Dahomey comes into its being in 1720 or so. It gets involved near the end of the 1700s, about 1760 or so, in the slave trade process. And then it's out of it by 1750, completely, 1752, okay? But in that period of time, there's the conflicts and the wars, because the Portuguese are not sitting there with merchant, with banks and some money in their hand. They've come with armies with guns, all right? And they have people involved in this thing with weapons. And they've armed coastal people to go inland to capture other people for them. They've already depleted the coastal people they could take, but they need a coastal population because they need somebody who can speak the language, somebody who knows the terrain, somebody who knows the culture, etc. And they need numbers. And so they could take these captive people and make them their collaborators, though many of those people will resist them and betray them. That's why it's important to understand the history, because it's not a one look.
Right.
You have to really see the intricacies of resistance and rebellion and death. It's just like most people come to North America and say, well, y'all never really freed yourself. Well, you never looked at our history to say that. There's recorded at least 300 plus African rebellions that was of significance in the United States, North America. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the Civil War, over 300,000 of us fought in uniform, and another 400,000 to 500,000 out of uniform behind the line, being workers, being supporters, being the people who carrying the equipment. So nearly 500,000 plus of us is fighting in the Civil War to destroy the Confederacy, both from within and without. That's a war of liberation on our part.
All right, how's everybody doing today? Hotep, hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. All right, share this broadcast on social media platforms. Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like. Hope everybody's doing well today. So it is Monday, February 20th, 2023. And some of you all saw me on Faraji Muhammad's show, The Culture Today, on the Black Star Media Network. And at the end of our discussion, I talked about my 12-week online course that I teach on Saturdays, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Slave they do teach in school. We deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. Okay, it's been some time since I've done a overview or a preview of the actual content of the course. Now, a lot of people about the content of the course, and we have there's 250 slides in the class. I do a PowerPoint presentation. We have book references, articles, video clips. There's about 250 slides. There's probably about 60, 70 articles that we reference in the class. And this is a 12-week online course, okay, that I teach. Now, we can't start studying our history in slavery, even when we deal with the transatlantic slave trade. We can't start in 1619. I know the 1619 project is airing on the Hulu channel right now, but we can't start in 1619. We can't start in the 1440s with the Portuguese getting involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And the Portuguese are the first ones involved in 1441 with Anton Gonzalez going into Mauritania. We have to understand the history chronologically. And this is something that we look at in the class. We look at this history chronologically, and we go through and look at thousands of years of history and see what actually leads to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. And then we look at the slavery here, of course, in this country that we call the United States of America. We have to understand the history chronologically and deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors, who take the teachings from ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, into the Iberian Peninsula, today known as Spain and Portugal. And it's going to be these teachings that the Moors take into Europe from the Nile Valley region of Africa. It's going to be these teachings that bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. Okay. And then the next period that Europe enters into is called the Renaissance era, which is a period of new enlightenment. So we have to deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors, who entered the Iberian Peninsula in 711 AD. This course not only deals with the transatlantic slave trade, but thousands of years of history that leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. August 20th, 2019 marked the 400th year anniversary of those 20 and odd Africans or 20 and odd Negroes who came into Point Comfort August 20th, 1619, in what would later be called the colony of Virginia. Now, this is on the White Lion pirate ship, which was an English pirate ship. And even though that did happen, August 20th, 1619 did happen, Africans were in the land we call the United States of America, going back at least 51,700 years. Okay. And we reference the work from Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. And we look at a number of different archaeological discoveries as well in the class. We look at a number of different archaeological discoveries also. Now, August 20th, 2019 marked the 400th year anniversary of those 29 Africans who came into Point Comfort in what would later be the colony of Virginia. Okay. And they come into, it's actually Hampton, Virginia, that they come into. Now, this year was known as the year of return. 2019 was known as the year of return, as many African Americans were and continue to reconnect to Africa and travel to Ghana and other West African countries. When we discuss the transatlantic slave trade, we first have to understand that African people are the original people of North, Central, and South America. Okay, African people are the original people of North, Central, and South America. And we've been in the land that we call the United States of America going back at least 51,700 years. Now, this does not mean that the transatlantic slave trade did not happen. Yes, it did. We have to understand thousands of years of history that lead up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. Okay. So I posted the link here on the thread of the broadcast. You can register for this 12-week online course. We do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded. You don't have to worry about not being in class while the session is going on or anything like that. Even after the 12-week online course is over with, a year from now, 2 years from now, you have full access. You can go watch the entire course. So visit our website, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com, to register for this 12-week online course, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. You can also use this information with your children. I would say the content is PG-13. And I'll also share information with you how studying our history benefits our children and benefits us as a people, because there's studies that document this also. So recently we've seen attacks on the teaching of African American history and African history in public schools across the country, especially in a lot of these former Confederate states. Okay, we see the attacks going on against the Advanced Placement African American Studies course coming from the College Board, the attacks from Florida. I talked about this on the African History Network show on Sunday, February 19th, and I've been talking about this probably going back at least a month now, going back to January of 2023. College Board hits back at Florida's initial rejection of AP African American Studies course and admits it made mistakes in rollout. So we see these culture wars being played out. We see books being banned. We see Reverend Al Sharpton led a march in protest against Governor Ron DeSantis banning this Advanced Placement African American Studies course Wednesday, February 15th, 2023. Okay, so we saw that take place. We've seen after Juneteenth became a federal holiday in 2021, signing the law became a federal holiday. We started seeing a lot more articles being written about Juneteenth. And this article here from the New York Times is a very interesting article. And most Americans know little or nothing about Juneteenth, poll finds. Most Americans know little or nothing about Juneteenth, poll finds. And in the article, it talks about 60% of Americans know little or nothing about Juneteenth. And be quite honest with you, a lot of the information that's floating around about Juneteenth, a lot of that is inaccurate. It wasn't the last day of slavery. There's a lot. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the enslaved Africans. So there's a lot of misinformation floating around. We see attacks on teaching. We see attacks on having Black History Month in schools also because of these anti-critical race theory laws. So in 2022, we saw a lot of stories that dealt with how it's harder to celebrate Black History Month and teach it in schools that have these new laws, these new rules. This article here from Axios.com, new rules are limiting how teachers can teach Black History Month. New rules are limiting how teachers can teach Black History Month. And then we see stories about what I call slave lessons gone wrong, or stories about slavery gone wrong. This is an article from the USA Today, mock slave auctions, racist lessons, how U.S. history class often traumatizes, dehumanizes Black students. Okay, so you have this article here that's from 2021, and then this one, Republican state lawmakers want to punish schools that teach the 1619 Project. So we see these attacks on the 1619 Project. We see these attacks on teaching African history, etc. And a lot of this has to do with white fear. A lot of this has to do with the fear of the browning of America, okay, which is why us understanding our history is so critical right now. Yes, it should be taught in every school across the country, as Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who created Negro History Week in 1926, as he correctly stated. Yes, it should be. But what we're dealing with is the fear of the browning of America, and the fear that some white people have that by the year 2043, white people will no longer be the majority population in this country. So if we look at this article here from June 20th, 2018 from the New York Times, fewer births than deaths among whites in majority of U.S. states. Okay. And in this article from the New York Times, it talks about how deaths now outnumber births among white people in more than half the states in the country. Demographers have found signaling what could be a faster than expected transition to a future in which whites are no longer a majority of the American population. The Census Bureau, the U.S. Census Bureau, has projected that white people could drop below 50% of the population around 2045, a relatively slow-moving change that has been years in the making. But a new report this week, when this article came out, it came out in June of 2018. But a new report this week found that white people are dying faster than they are being born now in 26 states out of 50, which is up from 17 states out of 50 just 2 years prior. And demographers say that shift might come even sooner. Quote, it's happening a lot faster than we thought. It's happening a lot faster than we thought, said Rogelio Saenz, S-A-E-N-Z, who is a demographer at the University of Texas at San Antonio and a co-author of the report. It examines the period from 1999 to 2016 using data from the National Center for Health Statistics, the federal agency that tracks births and deaths. He said he was so surprised at the finding that at first he thought it was a mistake. And we know one of the large contributing factors is the opioid crisis and how it's devastated a lot of white Americans in various states. Now, when you look at the 2020 census, The 2020 census was the first census since 1790 where the population of white people dropped below 60%. It was 57% in the 2020 census. You can go to census.gov and read it. Okay. So we have all this going on right now. So us understanding our history, us understanding African history, African American history is more important than ever based upon what we're dealing with. And we have to understand history, law, politics, and economics. History, law, politics, and economics, because they are all interrelated, interconnected. So when you see me on Roland Martin Unfiltered, you see me on Faraji Muhammad show, The Culture, you hear me talk about this. You listen to the African History Network show, you hear me talk about this as well. Okay, now, so the 1619 project, you've heard me talk about it. You've heard there's some good information there, but you've heard my criticisms about it. And it's important for us to understand that much of what we've been told about Virginia's 1619 first Africans is wrong. Okay. Much of what we've been told about Virginia's 1619 first Africans is wrong. There's a good article from VirginiaMercury.com from August 11th, 2019 that deals with this. And in 1619, codified slave laws didn't exist in any of the 13 colonies. And a lot of people are so shocked when they hear this. The whole way that slavery evolved in this country and even the way race evolved in this country is different than the way we actually think it evolved. Okay. I mean, that gets also in the Bacon's Rebellion, 1675, 1676, in the colony of Virginia, what happens after Bacon's Rebellion and the introduction of the term white in the colony of Virginia around 1681 to break up the alliance between enslaved Africans, free African Americans, poor whites, white indentured servants, things of this nature. That all comes to a head in Bacon's Rebellion, where you have this rebellion of about 500 people of different races, different statuses, some enslaved Africans, some white indentured servants, etc. And they burned down the town of Jamestown, Virginia in 1676 because they were all being exploited on the tobacco plantations in Virginia. And they realized that they had a common enemy. They were being exploited by the ruling elite. Okay, this is Bacon's Rebellion. Then you go to 1705 and the Virginia slave codes of 1705, which is going to become a model, and other colonies are going to adopt these slave codes. And the Virginia slave codes of 1705 make a distinction between Negroes and Moors. So you get into this, you start dealing with a deep understanding of history, and you start seeing how all this evolves and nationalities and status, and start seeing how all of this evolves. Okay. So the way this history actually happens is much different than the way we think it happens. So the way we talk, I like this type of information. Like on the broadcast. Okay, continue here. And we have the link here in the thread of the broadcast where you can register for this 12-week online course. It's on sale, $80, regularly $130. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they teach you in school. All right, now, Africans were in South Carolina in 1526, 93 years before Virginia. Okay, now this is not talked about a lot. We focus on 1619, and I have to tell people, they say we first came to these shores 1619. No, we were here thousands of years before that. But even if you just look during the transatlantic slave trade, the Spanish were taking Africans into the territory we call South Carolina in 1526. Okay, now this is something we deal with all this in the class because we go through and look at this history chronologically. So these are all slides from the course that I teach, that I put together. I'm a historian, been studying history 32 years. I put together this curriculum as well as the second class that I teach, which is from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1800 to 1968, which goes through and goes deep into looking at that 168-year period of history and analyzing what happened to us also after slavery ended. Okay, now before 1619, there was 1526, the mystery of the first enslaved Africans in what became the United States. There's a good article from Washington Post, September 7th, 2019, September 7th, 2019, that deals with this history. 1526 is not talked about a lot, okay? And you had those Africans, there's going to be an uprising. They're going to overthrow their oppressors and they're going to run away. And it's believed they went to live with Native Americans. So it was the Spanish tried to set up the settlement, but it was a failed settlement. Now, Spanish explorers brought 100 African slaves to a doomed settlement in South Carolina or Georgia. Within weeks, the subjugated revolted, then vanished. Maybe that's why they don't want us to know about 1526, because those Africans overthrew their oppressors. So maybe that's why that's not talked about a lot. But that's 93 years before Jamestown, Virginia. And then in 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon, the Spanish conquistador, comes into Florida, and he has an African with him named Juan Garrido. Juan Garrido was born in West Africa around 1480. And Juan Garrido is probably the first African we know of by name, in this land that we call the United States of America, or what Native Americans call Turtle Island. And Dr. David Imhotep talks about Turtle Island in the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. Okay, so we look at some different African civilizations, ancient African civilizations like ancient Nubia. And we look at African empires besides Egypt that Europeans and Arabs tried to claim as their own. One of them is ancient Nubia, okay, or Ta-Nehisi, which existed from about 4500 BC to 500 AD. And Nubia is the mother of ancient Kemet. Nubia is the mother of ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. Okay, because and Abyssinia or Ethiopia is the grandmother. So to understand ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, you have to understand Nubia and understand Ethiopia. Now, ancient Nubia or Ta-Seti or Ta-Nehisi, also known as Kush, which was more of a region. Kush was more of a region than a kingdom. And some of that also depends upon which period of time you're talking about as well. But ancient Nubia was a region along the Nile River located in northern Sudan and southern Egypt or southern Kemet. Okay. And today, the lower portion of Egypt and the upper portion of the Sudan, that is where Nubia was. Okay. The geographical demarcations that we see on the map that we see in Africa, the 54 African nations, those largely come from the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. Okay, the Berlin Conference, the conference to divide Africa. There's a good article that I referenced, the interview that I did with Professor James Small. And we talked about, I think it was in the interview where we talked about the Woman King. There was a good, there's a good article from thought.co, okay? And it's on the Berlin Conference. This one right here. The Berlin Conference to Divide Africa. The colonization of the continent by European powers. This article is from June 30th, 2019. And it goes in, deals with some of the history of these 14 European nations having this conference in Berlin, Germany. And they carve up Africa into colonies. Okay, they carve up Africa into colonies. This is one of the ways how Great Britain got so much territory in Africa from the Berlin Conference also. Okay, so check this out. This deals with the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. There was no African representation at the Berlin Conference. Okay, there was no African representation at the Berlin Conference. These were all Europeans. Now, It was, so when we look at Nubia, it was home to some of Africa's earliest kingdoms, known for rich deposits of gold. Nubia was a major trading port for luxury goods that came from sub-Saharan Africa, such as incense, ivory, and ebony. The first monarchy of recorded history was established in Nubia. The Nubians were also known for their exceptional archery skills that provided the military strength for their rulers. Kings of Nubia ultimately conquered and ruled Egypt for about a century, for about 100 years. Monuments still stand in modern Egypt and Sudan at the sites where Nubian rulers built cities, temples, and royal pyramids. Now, also, there are twice as many, when we look at the Sudan today, there are twice as many pyramids in the Sudan as there are in Egypt. Okay, there are over 200 pyramids in the Sudan. Okay, there are twice as many in the Sudan as there are in Egypt, because the Sudan, Nubia, was the mother of ancient Kemet. Okay, now in the 1800s, the Western world's interest in Nubia was awakened by the rediscovery of the ancient empire's monuments, which were reported almost simultaneously by individual British, French, and American explorers. Many of them found it difficult to credit indigenous Africans for building such a civilization. So they tried to say that the Nubians were white as well, just like they tried to say that the ancient Egyptians were white, or some of them said that, some of the archaeologists said the ancient Egyptians were brown-skinned Caucasians or something like this, or they tried to say they were Semites, anything but black Africans. They could not admit that these were Negroes. Okay, they could not admit that these were black Africans. They had to be Semites, they had to be brown-skinned Caucasians, biracial, triracial, something like that. All right, in this this clip right here, you have a scientist, a white scientist, disappointed when he finds out that ancient Egyptian pharaohs were black Africans. They did the scientific analysis, and he had to admit that they were black Africans. He was disappointed when it happened. This was from this clip was from the History Channel. And we actually posted this on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. He got thousands of likes. It went viral. Now, during the 1840s, German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius, Lepsius, asserted confidently that the Greek term Ethiopian, when referring to ancient civilized people of Kush, did not apply to Negroes, but was used to describe the reddish-skinned people closely related to the Egyptians who belong to the Caucasian race. Okay, they do whatever they can to discredit it. They don't want to admit these are black Africans. Now, Nubia was the first recorded monarch in history. Ancient Egypt is the first major civilization in Africa for which records are abundant. It was not, however, Africa's first kingdom. A March 1st, 1979 New York Times front page article written by journalist Boyce Rensberger reported, quote, evidence of the oldest recognizable monarchy in human history preceding the rise of the earliest Egyptian kings by several generations has been discovered in artifacts from ancient Nubia. By ancient Nubia, end quote. Now, the artifacts including hundreds of fragments of pottery, jewelry, stone vessels, and ceremonial objects such as incense burners were initially recovered from the Cusco Cemetery by Keith C. Seal, a professor at the University of Chicago. Okay, so then we look at the Punic Wars, and we look at civilizations like Carthage and the Carthaginians and their fight against the Romans in the three Punic Wars as well. Now, we know Carthage is in North Africa. It's in the area that today is Tunisia. We look at Hannibal Barca, okay, who was a Carthaginian, one of the greatest military strategists in history. He became a general at the age of 26. So we go through and look at that and the Punic Wars and their fight against Rome. We look at the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC, where Hannibal Barca defeats the Roman army, and the Roman army, they lose about 70,000 soldiers in one day. Is looked at one of the greatest military victories in history. We know that Carthage is going to exist from 816 BCE, before the Common Era, or BC, to 146 BC. Carthage is going to be destroyed by Rome in 146 BC. And you also deal with Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus in the Second Punic War. And after the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, when Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus defeats Hannibal Barca, is going to be was Publius Cornelius Scipio at this point, is going to be after the Battle of Zama that Scipio takes the surname Africanus. Africa was not named after Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. He took his surname after the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. And I go through and we deal with linguistics and understand language in the class also, because Africa is a Latin word. Ca is a Latin suffix denoting land. The prefix Afri refers to the Afri, who are a group of Black African people in Algeria and Tunisia. That area where Tunisia used to be called Carthage. Okay, so in Africa means land of the Afri. Okay, it's not named after a Roman general. Africa was not named after a Roman general at all. So as you get deep into the history, then you start studying language and seeing how it relates to history. And a lot of these myths that are being pushed fall apart. Carthage was founded in the 9th century BCE, before the Common Era, on the Gulf of Tunis. From the 6th century BCE onwards, it developed into a great trading empire covering much of the Mediterranean, and was home to a brilliant civilization. In the course of the long Punic Wars, from 264 BCE to 146 BC, Carthage occupied some of Rome's territories before finally being destroyed by its rival in 146 BCE. Now, in his book, World's Great Men of Color, Volume 1, history scholar J.A. Rogers asserts that the Carthaginians were descendants of the Phoenicians, a Negroid people, and that, in fact, until the rise of the doctrine of white superiority. Now, this is extremely important, because on the History Channel in 2016, they had a series called Barbarians Rising, and I watched it, Barbarians Rising, and it dealt with 700 years of invasions in the Roman Empire, okay, leading to the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, when the western portion, I should say the fall of the western portion of the Roman Empire, 476 AD, when the Vandals and the Visigoths crushed the western portion of the Roman Empire. Okay, so you had Nicholas Pennock, this actor Nicholas Pennock, portraying Hannibal Barca, because Hannibal was an African man. And you had some white people on social media, not all of them. You had some white people losing their minds, saying that the History Channel was lying, and that Hannibal was white and the Carthaginians were white, things of this nature. This is because of these lies that have been told. And Carthage is one of those African empires that Europeans tried to claim as their own. No, these were Black African people. These are descendants of the Phoenicians. Okay, so J.A. Rogers in World's Great Men of Color, Volume 1, said that the Carthaginians were descendants of the Phoenicians, a Negroid people, and that, in fact, until the rise of the doctrine of white superiority, Hannibal Barca was traditionally known as a Black man. Now, some people may be confused. They may be thinking about Hannibal on the A-Team with B.A. Baracus and the Face Man and Murdoch or something like that. They may be thinking of George Papard as Hannibal, or they may be thinking of Hannibal Lecter or something. No, but no, Hannibal Barca was Black African. He was not a European. Okay, now today, many encyclopedias classify the Carthaginians as whites or Semites, but ancient Greek and Roman eyewitness accounts paint a different picture. The indigenous peoples of Carthage were called the Afers, A-F-E-R-S, the Afers. Ancient Roman poet Virgil, in his poem Mortem, speaks of a woman from the Afer or Afra race, okay, of the Afar, from the Afer, A-F-E-R, Afar or Afra race, A-F-R-A, and he says of her, and all her figure proves her native land. Her hair was curly, thick her lips, and dark her color. Now, in Library of History book 20, Greek historian Diodorus mentions a Greek lieutenant named Agathocles who defeated a people in the area of present-day Tunisia in North Africa, present-day Tunisia, who were the same hue as the Ethiopians. Now, yes, Europeans also try to say that Ethiopians were white. And when Emperor Menelik II defeated the Italians at the Battle of Agojie in March of 1896, the Italians told the world that the Ethiopians were white because they didn't want the world to know that they were defeated by these African people. So when you go research the Battle of Agojie, March 1896, you see that the Italians were embarrassed. So they lied and said the Ethiopians were white. And, you know, some years ago when I was doing research on the mythology of Andromeda and Cassiopeia, there are two constellations named Andromeda and Cassiopeia, but they're named after mythological African women. And this comes out of you have them in Greek mythology, but these were African women, because we know, like Zeus, who was the king of the gods in Greek mythology, Zeus, according to Greek mythology, they tell you Zeus came from Ethiopia, okay, because Zeus was African. But I was researching Andromeda and Cassiopeia, and I came across a painting that dealt with this mythology, and the painting depicted the king of Ethiopia as being a Greek, as being European, and it was showing the people in the painting as being European. It was depicting Andromeda, Cassiopeia, things like this as Europeans. So I'm sitting there looking at this painting. It was a picture of the painting online. I'm looking at this. So I called Professor Kaba Hiawatha Kamene. Professor Kaba, some of you have seen or heard some of the interviews I've done with Professor Kaba. He's in the Hidden Colors documentaries. We're in the Black Friday documentaries together. And I said, look, I said, I'm doing research on the mythology of Andromeda and Cassiopeia. And I came across this painting that depicts the king of Ethiopia as being white. I said, when did the Greeks conquer Ethiopia? I don't remember that. He said they didn't. He said they didn't. They just conquered them in the artwork. So if you come across this painting and you see the king of Ethiopia depicted as a European, and you see Andromeda and Cassiopeia depicted as Europeans, then either one, you think the ancient Ethiopians were white, or you'll think that the Greeks conquered the Ethiopians, and both of them are wrong. But this deals with the colonization of mythology, the colonization of image. And as J.A. Rogers said in World's Great Men of Color, okay, the Carthaginians were descendants of the Phoenicians, a Negroid people, and that, in fact, until the rise of the doctrine of white superiority, Hannibal Barca was traditionally known as a black man, because as you have a rise in European powers, you have a rise in white superiority. You have Europeans who reinterpret a lot of these mythological images and religious images. So we know that they were worshiping the Black Madonna and Child, okay, all throughout Europe. And there are over 300 images of the Black Madonna and Child in France. France probably has the most number of images, paintings and statues and things like this of the Black Madonna and Child. And this was being worshipped even before the African Moors go into Europe, because this comes from Asar, Aset, and Heru, who the Greeks called Osiris, Isis, and Horus. This gets into a deep history, which takes you right back to ancient Africa and takes you back to the Nile Valley region of Africa. But as Europeans are going out conquering people's lands in the 1400s, they're going out conquering people's lands. They're recovering from the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which hit Europe in spurts from 1347 to 1400. And Europe loses between a quarter to a third of their population as they're going into the Caribbean and setting up sugarcane plantations, and they're rebuilding Europe, and they're extracting the mineral wealth and extracting Africans out of Africa and enslaving them, things like this. You start seeing a reinterpretation of a lot of these different figures, images, etc. And as you have a rise in European powers, you have a rise in the dominance of the European phenotype. And we go from the Black Madonna and Child to the decolorized version of that with the white Mary and Jesus. Okay. All right, Kate. Now, how do you all like this type of information? Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. Be sure to register for my 12-week online course that I teach. That this is a preview of. This is an overview of this 12-week online course called Ancient Kemet, one of the original names for Egypt, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. So when you scroll down our website, you'll see the information for my radio show, the African History Network show. You'll see the information for the free Black History Month lectures I'm doing each Saturday in February. The last one is Saturday, February 25th, 12 noon to 1:30 p.m. We have the link there to register for that. In the free Black Month lectures, we're dealing with Black resistance movements in the fight for freedom from 1630 BC in antiquity to 2023 Common Era. Today, attacks on voting rights and teaching African American history. Okay. Then we have the information for the 12-week online course. It's on sale $80, regularly $130. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade. I teach that class 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Saturdays. You can click right here on the link to register for the full course. We do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded. You can go back and watch it anytime. Okay. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Now, the second class that I teach that starts up Sunday, February 26th. The second class that I teach is from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1800 to 1968. From the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1800 to 1968. And we go through and look at this history basically year by year. We go through and look at this history chronologically to see what leads up to the Civil War taking place. And then we analyze the Civil War. We look at the Reconstruction era, 1865, 1877, Jim Crow era. We look at the Great Migration, 1915, 1970, 6 million African Americans migrating from the South up north and out west. World War I, World War II, Civil Rights Movement, and Black Power movement, to understand what happened to us after slavery ended. What were the laws and policies put in place to put us where we are today, to understand where we need to go from here. Okay, so that's from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1800 to 1968. So you can register for both of those classes. The same is the same format for both classes. And we have a bundle pack where you get both classes